As a field, art history was the subject of intense scrutiny, criticism, and reimagination in the 1970s and 1980s, with contemporary artists such as Hans Haacke explicitly tracing the complex and often objectionable ties between museums, politics, and economic inequality. Marxist critics such as John Berger arguing that the history of European oil painting was largely a phenomenon rooted in privilege and acquisitiveness, and art historians such as T.J. Clark employing the word crisis to characterize the state of their own academic discipline. It was hardly possible to maintain that art history was neutral, objective, or even entirely healthy. Instead, many art historians sensed a need for rejuvenation. Svetlana Alpers was one of those art historians, and she played a formative role in shaping what was often called the new art history. Born in 1936, Alpers earned her PhD from Harvard in 1965 and taught art history at Berkeley for more than 3 decades before retiring in the 1990s. While still a graduate student, she wrote an important analysis of Vasari's lives, treating the famous text not as a transparent source of factual objectivity, but rather as a composed literary work that relied on specific descriptive strategies. Ultimately, though, her most well-known piece of scholarship focused not so much on Vasari as on the possibility of an art history that constituted a meaningful alternative to Vasari. But let's try to be specific. Alpers was primarily interested in Northern Baroque painting, but soon became acutely aware that Vasari's account of Italian Renaissance art simply couldn't be applied very easily to works by Rembrandt, Vermeer, and others. For one thing, she pointed out, it seemed unlikely that the 3-stage developmental model that Vasari had employed could be applied to the history of Dutch art. Moreover, argued Alpers, Italian art was the product of what might be called a textual culture. It was an art that largely foregrounded allegorical, emblematic, or philosophical meanings. As a result, Vasari and other early commentators tended to emphasize ways of reading a painting by discerning layers of literary reference. By contrast, she argued, Dutch Golden Age art was the product of a truly visual culture, a culture that produced high-end microscopes, increasingly precise accounts of the retina, and detailed maps of the world. This was a culture, Alpers proposed, that was more interested in visual description than in literary sources. Dutch imagery as a whole thus arguably constituted an attempt to chart, to render, and to display, rather than, say, to allude or idealize. And so Alpers' book represented an attempt to move beyond Vasari and to erect a set of analytical tools that was more sympathetic or sensitive to its particular subject. But Alpers was also interested at the same time in how Dutch art seemed to be predicated on an entirely different way of thinking about and even seeing the world. Italian Renaissance artists and critics had traditionally spoken of the picture plane as a window through which a world was seen, and had positioned the active eye of the artist or the viewer at the apex of a visual pyramid that opened onto that world. In an article also published in 1983, though, Alpers turned to Velázquez's famous Las Meninas and argued that it involved a remarkable fusion of 2 very different representational strategies. On the one hand, it employs the classical Italian strategy of using linear perspective and gazes to prioritize the viewer who sees the scene. But at the same time, the painting also drew on a northern notion of the world manifesting itself, a mode that Alpers associated with the camera obscura, a lens-based tool that allowed the world to project itself onto a surface. Velázquez's work, she concluded, compounds the 2 notions of seeing in a dazzling but ultimately unresolvable way, positioning the painter himself as if he is at once within and outside the court, and acknowledging but also complicating Italian models of seeing. In short, Alpers was making the case for close readings of European works that complicated or even subverted established Italian models of perception, and that no longer depended upon the important but slightly parochial ideas of Vasari. And in that sense, her work aligned with that of Michael Baxendale, whose own use of the term visual culture had initially intrigued Alpers, and whose close readings of contracts, dance manuals, and educational texts suggested that Renaissance visual culture was intensely local and specific rather than universally applicable. It made sense then when Baxendale eventually became a colleague of Alpers at Berkeley, which also successfully recruited T.J. Clark and thus became a sort of ground zero for the new art history in the 1980s. Indeed, Alpers even co-authored a book with Baxendale. In Tiepolo and the Pictorial Intelligence, the two scholars emphasized ways in which the late Baroque painter exploited, performed, and even acknowledged the limits of his medium. But Alpers is also well known for a 1988 analysis of the commercial aspects of Rembrandt's practice, where more conventional histories of Rembrandt had tended to focus on the artist's style, technique, or choice of subject matter. Alpers drew on Marx and commodity theory in relating Rembrandt's habits in his studio to his own financial situation and to the broader market for his work. Decades later, the so-called new art history is no longer new, but it remains still today an important development in the history of the field for the way in which it broke with long-established traditions and offered an engagingly new set of ways of thinking about the history of art. And for several reasons, Svetlana Alpers was a central figure in that exciting process of implicit critique and exemplary reimagination.